Today on Unforgettable Love Stories, we meet Adelaine, a mother whose journey began with what she describes as the wildest, most exciting night of her life. Are you there, Adelaine? We hear you.
Hello, here's Adelaine. This story begins on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, so quiet and calm that you'd think nothing could go wrong. After a tiring day, I was more than ready to just fall into bed and shut my eyes. And the moment my head touched the pillow, I thought I was set for a peaceful night. For the past 10 years, it's just been me and my son, Mike. My husband and I split up, not because things were bad, just that we grew apart. Being a single mum has been incredibly rewarding, but oh so challenging. Mike is my world, smart, funny, and always kind. But playing both mum and dad can really wear you out. That night, I was so tired I barely managed to change into my pajamas before I crashed into bed. The house was finally quiet. Mike had already gone to sleep after his usual evening routine of video games and homework. Finally, a moment just for me. The room was dark, with just a bit of moonlight sneaking in through the curtains. I cozied up under the blanket, feeling the warmth and comfort of my bed. Lying there, with the moonlight casting soft shadows, I curled up and thought about how calm life had been lately. After all the ups and downs since his dad left, it was just Mike and I, figuring things out together. Even though Mike was nearly 22, we were really close. He was always so caring, sometimes taking on too much for his age. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of him. He was such a good kid, and I felt so lucky. But that night I was too wiped out to think much. My eyelids were heavy, my body relaxed, and just as I was drifting off, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. I was half asleep, confused by the sound. The knock came again, gentle but urgent, snapping me out of my sleep fog. "Mum?" It was Mike's voice, soft and low. I opened my eyes, struggling to see as I looked towards the door. The hallway light was dim, just outlining Mike standing there. I pushed myself up, still groggy. "Mike, what's up?" I mumbled, still half asleep. He paused, then came into the room and shut the door quietly behind him. His movements were hesitant, like he wasn't sure he should be there. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly, not looking at me as he stood by the end of the bed. A wave of worry washed over me. Mike had been having a tough time sleeping ever since his dad and I split. He never said much about it, but I knew he felt the impact of all the changes. His dad's absence really affected him, and sometimes, like tonight, I could see the heaviness in his eyes. He shifted awkwardly, the moonlight glinting off his troubled face. "I keep thinking about things," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I patted the bed, signaling him to sit beside me. As he did, I could feel the chill from the outside seeping in, as if it wanted to join our quiet conversation. "Mum, do you ever wonder if things could have been different?" he asked, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't sure I had. There was so much pain in his question, a kind of deep, aching wonder that made my heart squeeze. We talked into the night about his hopes, his fears, and the what-ifs that haunted him. It was a conversation full of raw emotions, where each word seemed to carry the weight of the world. That night, we didn't just share a mother-son moment. We walked through a doorway into understanding each other on a new level. By the time dawn crept in, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, we had cried a little, laughed a little, and found a little peace. As we watched the sunrise together, I realized that no matter how tough things got, these moments of connection were what would keep us strong. It was a night of revelations, and although it started with unease, it ended with us both feeling a bit lighter, a bit more ready to face whatever came next. "Come here," I said softly, patting the empty space beside me. "You can stay here tonight if it helps." Mike hesitated again, standing there in the dim light before quietly slipping into bed. He lay on his side, facing me, and as I looked at him, I saw more than just tiredness. There was a heaviness, a burden that he had been carrying silently for far too long. His eyes held a flicker of something fragile, a vulnerability that he almost never allowed to surface. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked again, this time even softer, as though speaking too loudly might shatter him. He shook his head, his dark hair falling over his face like a curtain. "No," he said in a low, almost broken voice. I needed to be close to you." My chest tightened at his words. It had been so long since Mike had sought this kind of comfort, the kind he used to crave as a little boy, after a nightmare or a hard day. I reached out and gently pushed the hair back from his face, letting my hand linger on his cheek for just a moment. "That's okay," I whispered, smiling gently. "You can stay as long as you want. I'm right here." He gave me a small, almost shy smile, but his eyes didn't lose that shadowy depth. There was something locked inside him, something he wasn't ready to say, and I wouldn't push him. Instead, I lay back down, pulling the blanket up over both of us. The room fell quiet. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the sheets and the faint hum of the night outside. Minutes passed in silence. Mike's breathing slowed, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I thought he was finally asleep when his voice broke through the stillness, barely audible. "Mom, do you ever miss him?" I froze for a moment, not because I didn't know who he meant, but because I did. His father, the man who had walked away from us and left this void in both our lives. The question lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. "Yes," I finally said, my voice just as soft as his. "Sometimes I do." I felt Mike's eyes on me, searching for more. "Do you think things could have been different?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain. I let out a slow sigh. "Maybe," I said, honesty coating every word. "But we can't change what happened, Mike. We can only learn from it and move forward." Mike looked down at the blanket, his fingers tracing its edge absent-mindedly. Sometimes I feel like it's my fault," he admitted, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Like, if I had been better, if I had done something different, maybe he would have stayed. The raw pain in his words hit me like a tidal wave. I sat up quickly, turning to face him fully. "Mike, no," I said firmly, my voice shaking. "This wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault." "But it feels like it is," he whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. Like if I wasn't such a burden, maybe he wouldn't have left. Tears spilled from my eyes as I pulled him into a tight embrace. "You listen to me," I said, my voice cracking. "Your father leaving had nothing to do with you. He made his own choices, and those choices are on him, not you. You've never been a burden, Mike. You are my heart, my everything. You've always been more than enough." Mike trembled in my shoulder, his tears soaking into my shoulder. I held him tighter, as if my embrace alone could shield him from every ounce of pain he'd ever felt. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice muffled. "You don't need to apologize," I said, gently rocking him back and forth. "You're allowed to feel what you feel, but I need you to know, really know, that you are loved. And none of this was your fault." We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's shoulders. Slowly, I felt the tension in his body ease, his breathing becoming steadier. Finally, I felt him begin to relax, his weight sinking against me as sleep began to take him. Even as his breathing slowed, I stayed awake, staring at the faint glow of moonlight on the ceiling. My mind swirled with memories, with guilt, and with love. I knew that night wouldn't erase the scars we both carried, but it was a step, a moment of healing in a journey we were taking together. And as I held him close, I made a silent promise. No matter what came next, we would face it together. He would never have to carry this burden alone again, but there was something else too, something I hadn't anticipated. As I held Mike close, a warmth spread through me. Not just the familiar warmth of a mother's love for her son, but something deeper, something more complex. It was a feeling I couldn't quite define, one that comforted me yet left me unsettled. I tried to push it away, tried to focus solely on the steady rhythm of Mike's breathing, but the feeling lingered, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for me to confront it. And as I lay there in the quiet darkness, holding my son close, I began to sense that things were shifting between us. But I wasn't sure if I was prepared for what that shift might mean. This moment felt like the beginning of something unfamiliar, something that demanded acknowledgement even as I resisted it. The next morning arrived far too soon. The pale sunlight crept in through the curtains, waking me before I was ready to face the day. Mike was still sound asleep beside me, his face relaxed, the tension that had weighed him down the night before now gone. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with that familiar protective warmth. But beneath that, the other feeling remained. It was the same one I had tried to bury the night before, the one that refused to be ignored. I slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to disturb him, and made my way downstairs to start breakfast. As I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, my thoughts wandered back to our late-night conversation. Mike had always been a sensitive soul, but I hadn't realised just how deeply he had internalized the pain of his father's absence. The guilt he carried was something I should have noticed sooner, and the fact that he had kept it to himself for so long weighed heavily on my heart. But it wasn't just the conversation that stayed with me. It was the way Mike had looked at me, the way he had sought solace in my arms. It was as if he had crossed a line between simply needing me as his mother and seeking something more profound, more intimate. And the truth was, I had felt it too. The warmth I experienced while holding him, the way his presence comforted me, wasn't solely about maternal protection. It was something else entirely, something that left me feeling both grounded and unsteady. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts as I flipped another pancake. "He's just a boy," I reminded myself firmly. "Your son." But no matter how many times I repeated it, the feeling didn't fade. It lingered, quiet but persistent, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. A few minutes later, Mike shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His hair was tousled, and in that moment he looked so much like the boy he used to be, his long frame still catching up with his teenage growth spurt. I forced a smile, hoping to shake off the strange emotions from the night before. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said, placing a plate of pancakes on the table in front of him. "Morning," he muttered, his voice still thick with sleep as he sat down and began eating. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the morning light streaming through the windows, bathing the kitchen in a warm, golden glow. But I could feel Mike glancing at me every now and then, as though he was testing the waters, wondering if I'd bring up what had happened during the night. I stayed quiet. He seemed lighter this morning, more like himself, and I didn't want to risk stirring up emotions that he might not be ready to face again. For now, the silence was enough. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "Thanks for last night, Mum. I really needed that." His voice was quiet, but the raw honesty in his words caught me off guard. I looked at him, surprised by how open he was being. "You don't have to thank me, Mike. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on mine, holding a depth that went beyond the surface. There was something in the way he looked at me, a softness mixed with something unspoken. It reminded me of how he had looked at me in the darkness the night before, as if searching for something I wasn't sure I could name. His gaze stayed a beat longer than usual, and for a moment I felt my breath hitch. The rest of the day unfolded quietly. Mike spent most of his time upstairs, switching between homework and video games, while I busied myself with chores around the house. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing you could point to as a clear change, but it was there. A subtle tension, a shared understanding that neither of us acknowledged aloud. As the afternoon turned into evening, I found my thoughts drifting back to Mike. I thought about how much he had grown, how he was no longer the little boy who used to cling to my side. He was becoming his own person, independent and strong. But what stayed with me more than anything was the closeness we had shared the night before, the way it felt so natural to hold him, to be there for him in that intimate moment. And the more I let myself think about it, the more I realized that my feelings had begun to shift. They weren't just the feelings of a mother, they were something deeper, more complex, and the realization both frightened and comforted me. That night, after dinner, Mike and I found ourselves on the couch watching a movie together. The room was softly lit, the glow from the TV flickering across the walls. We didn't speak much, words felt unnecessary. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged in a way that hadn't been before. As the movie played, I became increasingly aware of how close Mike was sitting. His arm brushed against mine every time he shifted, and each touch sent a quiet ripple through me. My heart beat faster, though I tried to focus on the screen. The tension between us was undeniable, even though neither of us addressed it. Every small movement, every glance, felt heavy with unspoken emotion. Halfway through the movie, Mike shifted again, this time letting his arms rest fully against mine. He didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a wave of heat through my body, and I glanced at him instinctively. He was already looking at me, his eyes soft, but there was something else in them, something deeper that made my breath catch. It wasn't just affection, it was something more, something that mirrored the feelings I had been trying to push down all day. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand in mine. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Our fingers intertwined naturally, and Mike didn't flinch or pull back. Instead, he squeezed my hand gently, his thumb brushing against my skin in a way that sent a flutter through my chest. We sat there, hand in hand, the movie continuing in the background, though neither of us was paying attention anymore. The silence between us was no longer just quiet, it was full, heavy with the meaning of the moment. I could feel the shift, the turning point that this was. Mike wasn't just my son anymore. He was someone I cared for in a way that went beyond the boundaries of maternal love. The movie ended, but we didn't move. The credits rolled on the screen, casting soft light across the room. Slowly, I leaned my head against Mike's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. His chest rose and fell in a calm, soothing pattern, and I let myself relax against him. It was a small gesture, but it felt incredibly intimate, more so than anything we had shared before. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us speaking, just existing in the quiet, in the warmth of each other's presence. And deep down, I knew things were changing. This was only the beginning. "Mom," Mike said softly, his voice barely audible, but it carried a weight that made me pause. "Yeah?" I replied, my tone matching his quietness. "I'm really glad you're here. I don't know what I'd do without you." His words hit me like a gentle wave, warm and unexpected. My heart swelled, and without thinking I squeezed his hand, a silent reassurance of the bond we shared. "I'm glad I'm here too, Mike, and you don't ever have to worry about losing me. I'm not going anywhere." A soft smile spread across his face, and for a moment we sat together in the comfort of that unspoken understanding. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was full of meaning, of connection. It felt like a rare kind of love, the kind that isn't always easy to define but is deeply felt. As I rested my head against Mike's shoulder, something shifted inside me. There was an undeniable sense of closeness, of intimacy, that went beyond what I had ever known. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of comfort, it was deeper, more profound. And though I didn't fully understand it at the time, I felt an unspoken thrill, a quiet excitement that left me wondering. The days that followed were marked by this unspoken connection. We went about our daily lives as usual, but beneath the surface everything felt different. It was as if an invisible thread had been woven between us, drawing us closer with each passing moment. Every glance, every touch, every shared silence seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. Our interactions were subtle but charged. Mike's presence seemed to fill the room in a way that felt new, his quiet gestures and thoughtful words taking on a deeper significance. I found myself lingering in his company, savouring the way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke. It wasn't just maternal affection anymore, it was something that defied simple labels. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, the atmosphere felt particularly heavy with that unspoken tension. Mike stood next to me, drying the dishes as I washed them. The rhythmic clink of plates and the soft hum of the evening filled the kitchen, but the air between us was thick with something unnameable. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. It felt almost surreal, as though we were suspended in time, wrapped in a quiet dream. I handed Mike a plate, and as our fingers brushed, a familiar warmth shot through me. It was such a small, simple touch, but it lingered, sending a flutter through my chest. I looked up at him, and our eyes met. His gaze was soft, filled with the same quiet intensity I had noticed before. "You okay, Mum?" he asked, his voice low, but laced with concern. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. Just thinking. Mike didn't immediately respond. He placed the dish down and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. Thinking about what? I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I didn't want to brush him off, but I also wasn't sure how much I was ready to share. Finally, I decided on the truth, or at least a part of it. "About us," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes stayed locked on mine, unwavering. "What about us?" he asked, his tone steady but filled with curiosity, maybe even hope. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The words hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniably present. I hadn't meant for the conversation to take this turn, but now that it had, there was no going back. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "It just feels like things have changed." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. Mike didn't look away. His eyes held mine, and in them I saw a reflection of the feelings I had been struggling to understand. There was no judgment, no fear, only a quiet acceptance and a willingness to face whatever came next, together. Mike didn't look away. Instead, he set the dish down on the counter and turned to face me fully, his eyes searching mine. "What about us?" My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't meant for the conversation to go in this direction, but now that we were here, there was no turning back. The tension between us hung in the air, heavy and thick, like the quiet before a storm. "I don't know," I whispered. "It just feels like things have changed." Mike stepped closer, his body just inches from mine now. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady rhythm of our breathing. He reached out gently, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch sending shivers down my spine. "They have changed," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But that's not a bad thing, is it?" I looked up at him, my heart racing. The way he looked at me with such tenderness, such care, it was overwhelming. My mind was spinning, but all I could think about was how close he was, how much I wanted to close the small distance between us and let myself fall into whatever this was. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what this is." Mike's hand lingered by my face, his fingers lightly grazing my cheek. "I think it's just us," he whispered. "It's just you and me." I took a deep breath, leaning into his touch for just a moment, letting the warmth of his hand soothe the storm inside me. For so long it had been just the two of us, navigating the world together, leaning on each other. Our bond had always been strong, but now it felt like it was evolving, becoming something more than what either of us had expected. When I opened my eyes, Mike was still watching me, his expression soft, but full of emotion. "Mum," he hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. "I don't know how to explain it, but I care about you. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone." His words made my heart skip a beat, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The emotions that had been building inside me for days, weeks even, came rushing to the surface, overwhelming me with their intensity. I had been trying to hold them back, trying to keep them in check, but now, standing so close to Mike with his hand on my cheek and his eyes full of love, I couldn't deny it anymore. "I care about you too," I whispered, my voice trembling. "More than you know." Mike's eyes softened even further, and for a moment we just stood there, frozen in time, the world outside the kitchen fading away. All that existed was the space between us, the connection that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Then, slowly, I leaned into him. I noticed he leaned towards me as well, and I put my leg over his. I kissed him, and he definitely did not hold back, his lips brushing mine in the most gentle, yet intimate kiss was the best I had ever felt. It was full of excitement, a powerful expression of the love that had been building between us. The moment got from bad to worse, and before I knew it, everything was happening. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me. and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. This wasn't wrong. It wasn't confusing. It was love, pure and simple, and it was the kind of love that had grown naturally between us, blossoming out of years of care, trust, and understanding. That's what I told myself while we were busy. After half an hour, Mike decided it was over, and we laid there, both slowly realizing what just happened. When Mike pulled back, he smiled at me, his eyes full of warmth. "We're okay, right?" I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My heart was too full, too overwhelmed by everything I was feeling. "Yeah," I whispered. "We're okay." That night, after we finished cleaning up, Mike and I sat together on the back porch watching the stars. The night was quiet, the air cool and crisp, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe. The weight of the unspoken emotions between us had lifted, and in its place was a sense of calm, a sense of peace. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. Just sitting beside each other, sharing the quiet of the night, was enough. There was no rush, no pressure. Whatever this was between us, it was evolving at its own pace, and I was content to let it unfold naturally. Mike reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently, and we sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle above us. It was love, tangible, real, and more powerful than I had ever expected. And as I sat there beside Mike, holding his hand under the blanket of the night sky, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. As the days turned into weeks, the quiet intimacy Mike and I shared became a part of our daily lives. We didn't need to talk about it much. Whatever was growing between us didn't need labels. It just was. It flowed between us naturally, in the way we looked at each other, the way we found reasons to touch, the way we shared those quiet, lingering moments that were ours and ours alone. But with each day that passed, I could feel the connection between us deepening, becoming more tangible, more real. And I no longer felt conflicted about it. Mike wasn't just my son anymore. He had become my partner in a way I hadn't expected. And it was as if our relationship had transformed into something that fit both of us perfectly, something we hadn't even known we needed. It wasn't until a rainy afternoon in late autumn that everything finally came into focus. The sky was dark, thick clouds swirling overhead, and the rain tapped steadily against the windows, filling the house with the calming sound of nature. Mike and I were sitting in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the fireplace as we sat together on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. The warmth of the fire mixed with the coziness of the moment, and I could feel the pull between us growing stronger. Mike was leaning against me, his head resting on my shoulder, and I absently ran my fingers through his hair, enjoying the quiet closeness we shared. There was something about the way the rain blurred the outside world, the way the fire made the room feel like our own little universe, that made everything seem more intimate, more intense. I could feel Mike's breathing slow and steady, and I knew without words that he was thinking the same thing I was. The unspoken emotions between us had grown so strong that it felt like we didn't even need to speak anymore. We were perfectly in sync, perfectly aligned. Mike lifted his head slightly, turning to look at me, and our eyes met. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the room filled with the soft glow of the fire and the steady beat of the rain. And in that moment, I knew that what we shared wasn't just love. It was something deeper, something that went beyond the simple label of mother and son. It was a bond that had evolved into something tangible, something real. "Mom," Mike whispered, his voice low but full of emotion. I didn't respond, just waited for him to continue, knowing that whatever he was about to say was important. "I love you," he said softly, his hand reaching out to take mine. "Not just because you're my mom, but because of who you are, everything about you. And I don't know if that's okay, or if it's wrong, but I can't help it." His words washed over me, filling the room with a warmth that made my heart ache in the best way possible. I had known this was coming. I had felt it too. But hearing him say it out loud, admitting the depth of his feelings, made everything feel more real. I squeezed his hand, feeling the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. "Mike," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "I love you too. I've always loved you, but this is different." He nodded, his eyes searching mine as if looking for reassurance, for some kind of answer to the question that hung between us. "I don't know what this means," I continued, "but I know that I feel the same way, and it doesn't feel wrong to me. It feels like it's just right." Mike's face softened, and he smiled. A small, gentle smile that made my heart swell with emotion. "I'm glad you feel that way," he whispered, "because I don't know what I'd do if you didn't." I reached up, brushing my fingers along his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my hand. "We'll figure this out," I said quietly, "together." For a long moment, we just sat there, holding each other's gaze, the room filled with the soft sound of the rain and the crackling of the fire. There was no need for words. Everything had already been said. We both knew what we felt, and we both knew that it was real, tangible. Mike leaned forward slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, and gently, hesitantly, he pressed his lips to mine. It was a soft, tender kiss, full of all the love and emotion we had been holding back for so long. There was no urgency, no rush, just the simple, pure expression of everything we felt for each other. When he pulled back, his eyes were full of emotion, and I knew that we had crossed a line that we could never go back from. But instead of feeling afraid, I felt at peace. It was as if this was where we were always meant to end up, and now that we were here, everything else in the world faded away. Mike pulled me closer, wrapping his arms around me, and we sat there together, holding each other as the rain continued to fall outside. The fire flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the room, and in that moment I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation, gentle touches, and soft kisses. We didn't talk about what the future held, or what this new chapter in our relationship would mean. We didn't need to. All that mattered was the present, this moment, here and now, where we could just be with each other. As the rain continued to fall outside, I found myself thinking about how much had changed between us in such a short amount of time. Mike had grown from a boy into a man, and in doing so, our relationship had transformed into something I hadn't expected, but something I had come to embrace. That night, Mike came into my room again, but this time there was no hesitation. He climbed into bed beside me, wrapping his arms around me, holding me close. It wasn't like the other nights where he sought comfort or reassurance. This time it felt like we were equals, like we had found something between us that was stronger than anything else in the world. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely and utterly content. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, I was ready for it. Mike and I had always been close, but now we were something more. We were partners in the truest sense of the word, and I knew that, no matter what the world threw at us, we would face it together. As I drifted off to sleep, I smiled softly to myself. It was crazy to realize all of this, but I didn't care about anyone's opinions, and it made me feel amazing.
What really matters is you found that peace you'd been looking for.
You're spot on about that, and I really appreciate the invite and this space to share my story.
No problem. Thank you for saying yes, Adelaine. And we want to tell all our listeners to send in their stories. If you like the story, subscribe.